I had to update my slides on the fly because this meme, whatever you want to call it, I don't even know what you want to call it. It's just too good not to be put in here. So anyway, with that being said, today we're going to talk a little bit about attack surface management. My goal with this talk and to give you a little bit of an introduction is to tell you how to deploy an ASM in your company. Some of my ideals with ASM are probably unrealistic with, open source software. So some of it you might have to take and shop as you will. But anyway, with that being said, my name is Ashley Knowles, and we're going to be talking about ASM today. All right, if I can change the slides. Here we go. So about me, I have a little over 10 years of cybersecurity experience. I started straight out of college and I was hired into a vulnerability and risk management team. From there, I was trained to do penetration testing. And I have about a grand total of 6 years consulting experience. I've also led an internal red team, and I developed an internal attack surface management platform at a previous company that I worked with. Since then, I have discussed ASM with clients, and I've helped them deploy their own instances of ASM inside of their companies. A lot of the time, on pen tests, we discuss with clients about how to figure out what they don't know about. During a pen test, we're given a scope and we're given what they know about, but we discover other things that they may not know. And so one of my goals is to teach you guys how to figure out what you don't know and scan it, and then also to use recon and OSINT and passive scanning to your advantage so that you can figure out what these assets look like, what your attack surface looks like without actually actively touching the targets. So my little meme in here, 1 year in Infosec, 10 years of Infosec. I certainly feel that way today. So first, what is ASM? ASM is the discovery, review, and reduction of potential attack vectors or points of vulnerability in an organization's infrastructure and digital assets. That's technically the definition of it. When we talk about ASM and more specifically your attack surface, it's referring to an organization's exposed assets that an attacker can target, whether they're secure, insecure, known or unknown, or active use or not. The reason why it's super important, and I've already kind of talked about this a little bit, is to be aware of what your attack surface looks like because it's continuously changing. New vulnerabilities are being introduced, changes are being pushed by your internal IT team without, probably being tested first. Third-party vendors are adjusting products, and those changes may not be tracked appropriately. Now, officially, the definition is right here on screen. In my mind, it's a tool that is used to generate actionable information. And so what are all those pretty words kind of telling you what to do? ASM really encompasses. I want to forewarn everyone again that this is my personal ideal version of what an ASM would look like. You may have instances of it already deployed in your environment. You may have knowledge of the open source software. You may have a, big billion-dollar company's deployed version of ASM inside of your company already. So what is it really? Did I skip a slide? No, I did not. Discovery, enumeration, historical data, threat intelligence, integration, and phishing risks, DDoS controls, reporting. Again, ideal version, right? When we're doing discovery, we're talking about the identification of assets, reconnaissance, OSINT, things that could be done through passive scanning. After your discovery, then you're looking at enumeration, identification of network assets, web applications, cloud infrastructure, APIs. And then you're moving on to historical data as you're tracking all of these enumerated assets. You're moving on to historical data. What are your new vulnerabilities? What do the changes look like? What does your trends look like? You want to have some piece of threat intelligence also inside of an ASM platform. Threat intelligence is, what are the CVEs coming out, vulnerabilities that have been released? What are APT groups doing right now? What are the TTPs that are being used? Ideally, ASM should include a threat intelligence dashboard where an organization can quickly search and learn about the latest vulnerabilities. And that dashboard would ideally also help researchers, stay up to date on emerging threats and news and exploits. And then, one of the other things that I think should be talked about more is integration with other tools, integration with open source tools like, cloud enumeration, Scout Suite, things that, you don't pay for, but you do still want to have in a centralized database where you can see all of your vulnerabilities, you can see all of your assets. That stuff is super key. And so with that being said, you want to have a better in-depth view of your company's most at-risk assets. And so phishing risks are another huge component of social engineering, of your attack surface in your company. Are you doing any sort of automated phishing? Are you testing your employees? Who is clicking on links? What links are the most clicked on? Is there any credentials that are being sent over? Are people executing, potentially malicious binaries? All of that stuff would also be awesome to have in a centralized database so that you can see, again, what you're looking at. And lastly, kind of reporting. Many ASM platforms do this really well in providing a variety of dashboards to help an organization gain insight, as well as to see which assets and targets need the most attention. Previously at a different company that I worked at, we also integrated some sort of DDoS testing. And so what that looked like was sending a bunch of packets at a source, seeing if our controls are working, seeing if the system accidentally falls over, seeing if failovers are working properly, seeing just how our systems are responding in real time to a DDoS attack. It wasn't really a DDoS attack, but the idea behind it was just to test our infrastructure and the controls and policies and procedures that are in place to see how the company's assets responded to a, quote, attack. So I found this pretty cool asset chart with, kind of the attack surface layers. It kind of touches on, your managed assets, your unknown assets, nth party assets like third party contractors, hosted data that's maybe in an infrastructure as a service platform, software as a service platforms, cloud APIs, things of that nature. We talk about inferior assets, virtual environments, development environments, short-lived cloud assets, bring your own device. Bring your own device is notoriously vulnerable because you have people introducing devices that aren't managed by the company into the network and potential issues there. So breaking down what assets are and the specific attack layers, surface layers, I'm not going to talk super in depth about this, but I want to hit on some of the high points that I think are super important. One of those really important ones is shadow IT. And so shadow IT refers to the use of IT related hardware, software by department without the knowledge of the IT department. So the best example I can think of is something like a shadow IT is someone in marketing saying, hey, what's the real risk of me just plugging in my NAS storage device or a printer on the network? What's the risk of that? And how do you as a company track that down? How do you as a company say, hey, something's been plugged in that's new to the network, we need to scan it? So the discovery of something like that and the enumeration of that device, making sure that it's configured properly, making sure the password is strong, making sure that that printer, for whatever reason, isn't, exposing, say, for example, files that have been printed out already. A lot of printers out there have some sort of feature where you can upload a file to a printer and you can print it out, and then it stores that file's data in the printer for X amount of time, right? And so that opens up a risk to someone that's sitting on your network saying, I can see all these files without any authentication. And it happens quite a lot. So when you're attack surface management, it's not just looking at your external space, but it's also looking at your internal space. It's looking at all of the devices that are on your network, IoT devices, for example. So another concern is contractors. And I'm not saying that contractors are vulnerable because they're contractors. I'm saying that contractors can be more vulnerable because they don't receive the same amount of training or have the same amount of controls as like regular employees may have because they're short-lived, right? And so are they publishing data inadvertently to something like GitHub that has keys in it, that has sensitive data in it, that has code that is considered to be private or proprietary? Do you have a way of searching Pastebin, Stack Overflow, GitHub, GitLab, whatever it might be? Do you have a workflow to search for those things, find potential code leaks, and then remove them? Do you have policies and procedures in place for that? ASM, well, doesn't answer the policy and procedure side of things. It also helps you identify where those potential leaks might be by saying, hey, I'm going to look for, these code words on the ASM platform, or sorry, on the GitHub or Pastebin platforms, and here are all the results. And so, of course, there's going to be garbage in there because you have all these bots sitting on, applications like GitHub that are constantly scraping web applications and, uploading like emails and stuff like that to those platforms. So you're going to have to weed through a little bit and, make those searches, you paste them down or pare them down so that they're more relevant to your organization. But as you get to a point where your scripts are, looking for things or learning based off of what they already found, like say, for example, you put in something machine learning so that it learns based off what it's found, it's going to give your data a little bit more accuracy over time. And then one of the other things that I think we don't talk about enough as an industry is the increased adoption of open source software, like I said, SaaS and IaaS and outsourcing, what that means to misconfigurations and your assets and the vulnerability discovery management. It makes it a little bit more complicated. And so when you have an ASM and you have that passive scanning in place, it can help you see a bigger picture of what your third-party vendors look like. And, I know that's kind of a gray area. Say, for example, you're scanning a third-party vendor. You don't want to do that. But you can still look at Shodan data because Shodan data has it for everyone to see. You can look at that Shodan data. You can use Google Docs to see if there are new vulnerabilities being introduced on the third-party vendors that you use. See if there's any open source software vulnerabilities that are being introduced. See if your SaaS provider has some breach of data, like SolarWinds, for example. ASM should help consolidate all of this and, in a sense, lessen that overwhelming feeling of trying to tackle all of these assets all at once. So one of the questions that I've had previously when I talk to organizations about attack surface management is, how does this differ from vulnerability scans that we pay for and already manage, like Nessus or Nexpose or Qualys, for example? One of the biggest differences, first of all, is scope, right? ASM assumes that organizations have many unknown assets and begins with discovery and reconnaissance in that aspect. ASM provides kind of a more holistic viewpoint of what the company's environment looks like from the outside and inside as well. It should understand that the potential implications of what a breach of one asset would mean for another asset in your environment too, meaning your ASM knows what your high value targets look like and what oh gosh, I just lost my place. Meaning your ASM should know what your high value targets look like, and whether that's self-defined by the organization or defined by the scanner itself. You can have an ASM look like it's alerting off of X number of ports. Say, for example, you have FTP open and it's going to go check for anonymous FTP. Yes, your vulnerability scan already does that. But when you're looking at an ASM platform holistically, you're looking at that target as a whole. So it's not just saying, okay, you have FTP anonymous here. It's saying you have FTP anonymous here, but this application also has access to X number of other systems in your environment. Or FTP anonymous, it goes in and it tries to authenticate and sees what it can pull down. ASM could do that exploit part of the equation, whereas a vulnerability scanner doesn't always try to exploit FTP anonymous. That's just one example of how it kind of domino effects inside of your environment. And like we talked about in a previous slide, ASM does a pretty dang good job identifying shadow IT technologies in use by not presuming what the scope is supposed to be. In a vulnerability scan, you have to feed it a scope. You have to tell it what to go scan. ASM will kind of go and find out for you. So that's kind of cool, in my opinion. Additionally, it should be noted that vulnerability management can be considered a tool that's used to strengthen attack surface management. So they're not kind of separate in that regard. You want them to be used together. And the ideal situation is that they are used together, that you're uploading your vulnerability scans or have some sort of process where your Nessus scan finishes and it automatically uploads that data to your ASM technology in place. All right. So reconnaissance. It's a huge piece of ASM, and so I wanted to touch on it quite a bit during this meeting. And one of the things that I want to talk about is what is it? What does active OSINT look like compared to passive OSINT? And so reconnaissance is technically information that can be gathered from publicly available resources. And so publicly available resources looks like Shodan. It looks like Google Docs. It looks like using, OSINT framework. And so ideally you want recon to be as hands-off as possible. You want it to be automatically looking for all of these targets, all of the recon that it can find, and then coming back with potential issues, potential things that someone can take action on. So reconnaissance is kind of like, in my opinion, again, the bones of ASM. It can be used to help an organization prioritize scope by searching certificates using an API on cert.sh, for example. It can look for organizations' names or nicknames or known naming schemas that are in use by the company. Say, for example, if you're looking at Shodan's API. Recon can be used to quickly identify which ports are open. And then again, you can use that domino effect of saying, hey, port 80 is open on XYZ target. So now we're going to go scan with web application enumeration. We're going to go look for potential directories. We're going to go look and see what the site map looks like. We're going to go see if there are any input fields. Are there any upload files? Or can you upload files to the web application? It's that domino effect of saying, I discovered something here. It has port 80 or 443 or 8443 or whatever it has open on it, right? And then saying, okay, we're going to go do XYZ now because we identified this. So using Shodan's API, you can have that system in place. You can also use Shodan to search for company names. It's not just used for like IP addresses or URLs. You can look for company names. So say, for example, we wanted to search BHIS in Shodan and see what comes up, or Black Hills. It can look for just about really anything keyword wise. And so this can all be done doing passive OSINT. You don't have to touch the system. You don't make direct contact with the target, but it does rely on that third-party information that's hosted. And so sometimes that could be inaccurate. Sometimes it's not complete. Shodan doesn't do a full port scan of targets. It looks at a high-level overview of all the target ports and services that are open. But I still think it does a pretty good job. Something that we just talked about previously too is code repositories. Those are notorious for leaking credentials, secret keys, private certificates, potentially sensitive code or infrastructure. When you're searching, like, again, Pastebin or Stack Overflow, you can use Google Docs to automate that stuff. You can use, API searches or things of that nature. You can use scripts that can automatically look for it, like something like AMAS or Recon NG. Those things can quickly grab potentially offending, links and information that's out there already. Some ASMs use like machine learning technologies that can go as far as to detect whether or not passwords are in use in those repos and provide prioritization based on whether or not that those repos have passwords that are in them. So that's something that's pretty neat too, that you're saying, hey, I have a repo that's sitting out here. The machine learning script alerted on a potential password. You have an action that's sitting there and saying, hey, you need to go look at this right now because there's a potential issue here. A vulnerability scan is not going to do that. A vulnerability scan is not going to say like, hey, there's passwords sitting in this repo. It just doesn't have that viewpoint, right? And so an ASM can be used to do something like that. And so, finally, there's credential leaks from breaches. You can have kind of like a repository of credential leaks and add to it as new breaches are announced and new credentials are leaked. to the dark web, whatever you want to call it. Many organizations have their own treasure trove already with like terabytes of breach data that can be searched through to identify if any existing employees are found in that database. I personally cannot recommend this enough because I can't tell you guys how many times on a pen test where I'm sitting there and I'm like, I have 500 user credentials sitting for this one client. Out of 500, there has to be at least one, right, that has valid credentials for some type of sign-in. And, you know, sometimes the credentials aren't invalid, but I would say probably about 50% of the time we have valid credentials sitting in a data breach for a contractor or an employee for a client, and that's how we gain access to something. You know, say for example, you have OWA open externally. You're like, okay, well, what can OWA actually do as an attack surface item for my infrastructure? Well, first of all, OWA doesn't always have two-factor authentication enabled. So if I do find a data leak and I have credentials in that data leak, I go sign into OWA, and then I can have access to that user's account. I can potentially phish other users. I can potentially use that person's account to send malicious data to someone else. You know, the possibilities are kind of endless as long as you have that foothold, I mean, you can, the possibilities are endless, like I said. So one of the other things too that I think is super important to point out is that domain names and identifying domain names is really important piece of this puzzle too. When I deployed this at a previous organization that I worked at, we did some searching and certificates, looking at like the SAN names to see if there was any other domain names possibly hosted inside of certificates. And we then would add that as a known asset, right? And we would go do some passive OSINT on it. And then it would alert on that new, you know, target, if you will. And it would say, hey, is this actually ours? And it would tell someone inside of the company that we need to go look at this asset, give it a yay or a nay on whether or not to go do some active scanning on that target. So when you have an ASM, it's not just saying we're going to discover things and scan it willy-nilly. No. We want someone to look at this stuff before we're actively scanning it, because we don't want to potentially impact someone else's client or someone else's system, especially when we get to cloud hosted devices where you have one server that is used for multiple different clients. You know, there could be some data leaching that's kind of happening there, so that when you have a target come up and it's saying, hey, yes, I host something here for this client, but they may also be hosting something for another client too. So you want to double check that information and make sure that it's correct before you say, yes, I want to scan this. And it does happen quite regularly on pen tests where unfortunately we're given bad data and we scan the wrong host, or someone has a typo in the scope. And so we're scanning, again, something that's not ours. I had that happen just the other day where a client mistyped an IP address, and it was unfortunate, but I'd scanned it assuming that it was the client's IP address. You know, you want to make sure, again, that we're scanning the correct things when we're actively scanning something. And it does get caught quite a bit, but as we're moving to the cloud, and again, as we're moving to this software as a service technology and infrastructure as a service technology, it's getting harder and harder to identify who is actually hosting something and who it belongs to. You know, you may have a product that's sitting in Azure and it reports back as like, who is that? It's Azure's product, and you're left to your own devices to determine whether or not it actually belongs to you. You have to go look at the certificate. You have to go look at the website. What if there isn't a website that's hosted and there's only port 21 that's open on it, or something that's lesser known or doesn't have a banner on it? Again, you have to do investigative research on it to make sure that it is yours. And it can be really hard to figure that out. ASM kind of helps you there a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still left up to you whether or not you can figure that out. So now that we talked about reconnaissance a little bit, let's move on to web applications, because like I said, when you're identifying what services are open on a host, You then want to have that domino effect of, okay, I found HTTPS open on this target. Now I want to go do web directory and file enumeration. I want to go look at the sitemap and enumerate the applications, see what's sitting here. We can take a snapshot of the application, assign it hash, and then you can go and use that data holistically and take another snapshot tomorrow, right? And see if the hashes differ between today's snapshot and tomorrow's snapshot. And that will tell you whether or not the web application changed from one day to the next. That is a super awesome way to see if someone makes a change between one day to the next. Another thing is fuzzing. You want to automate the injection of randomized data into web applications for bug detection. Fuzzing is something that I think is kind of left out a lot, especially with vulnerability scanning. It's not something that's really done. And even still, when we're testing for web application issues, web application scanning, especially in like Nessus, for example, it takes a really long time, right? And so if you're doing a network scan on a target and you ask it to do web application scanning too, it's going to almost double or triple your scan length time. So if you're scanning a lot of targets, it's going to be really hard to get all of this data, because by the time you scan it again, there probably is going to be a change. And so with ASM, you're kind of operating under this assumption that finds a host, right, with Recon, sees this port's open, and then it automatically assigns it a job to go scan it right now, to go do it right now. And as those scans are finishing, it's updating the database. And so you're seeing this data in real time as the scans are happening, as the scans are completing. So you don't have to wait for a vulnerability scan to complete to get that dashboard view of what it looks like. So another thing that's really interesting is the attack surface analysis on web application is a bit different and more involved than a network, right? We're looking to identify the functions of the web application, high-risk areas of code, and if changes are being made. So like I talked about, taking that snapshot, differing the hashes is going to help you with that changes are being made piece of the puzzle. And so we want to, like I said, grab that sitemap, enumerate the web application, look for hidden directories or web files. Again, one of the things that is very interesting is if you're able to do like web directory brute forcing and you find a file or an XML, sometimes there's credentials that are sitting in there. And again, you can have some type of machine learning script that goes and looks through those XMLs, downloads the XML, looks through it, and hunts out that password or credential. And then bam, you have all of that information, and no one has to actively touch the target, right? So it's doing all this work for you and then spitting out this data of what you need to actually go look at. Another thing that's really good about ASMs is it takes screenshots of all the web applications so that you can see what the actual web application looks like. Is this a default web content page? Is it IIS? Is it a login portal? Do you accidentally have your firewall sitting externally with the login available for anyone to hit? Things like that can be easily identified from a screenshot dashboard. And so taking those screenshots of the web applications can help prioritize applications that expose issues or verbose error messages. Another thing that can be done is, like I said, taking that snapshot to help identify changes that are being made. Sometimes your application team is pushing changes to a web application before testing those changes first. And it may be done inadvertently. It may be done because they don't realize that they're pushing a change to prod, right? And so having that ability to diff is super important. At the end of the slides, I've included a link to OWASP. OWASP has a really good, I think it's really good, definition of attack surface and what the attack surface of a web application should be. And so it's at the end of the slides in like the resources page for those of you that have downloaded the slides already. You want your web application to look for cookies and cryptographic controls. So, using things like securityheaders.com or SSL Labs in Qualys, things like that can be automated. Looking for cookie issues. Again, this stuff will pop up in vulnerability scans, but if you have an ASM doing this stuff too, it can help provide that whole body view of web application and the risk to the enterprise as a whole. Another thing is component version fingerprinting. You can use sometimes like jQuery has some really good checks inside of Burp Suite. If you have Burp Suite Pro version, you can download different modules and put them into place. And those modules, as it's going through and crawling the web application and spidering all of the pages, it will look for pages that have jQuery like defaults, jQuery, I guess, whatever you want to call it, the web application page itself, where it says what version of jQuery is used. And then it'll go out and check to see if there are any vulnerabilities using, like, I think the application is called like Synac or Synck, I think it's called Sync. Can't recall off the top of my head, so I'm gonna have to fact check myself on that one later. But yeah, you can still look for component version fingerprinting. And so question that just came up in Discord, is there any popular open source free ASM tools? Yes, I will be going over that one in a couple of minutes. And I do have a good list of, what is out there open source at the end of this. So again, if you look at the slides, there should be a slide towards the end with all of the different popular ASM platforms. For example, one of them is called Sniper. It's really great, super awesome. And then, looking at security headers, seeing if something is susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks. Those are also, things that can be done by an ASM to, again, help you look at that web application as a whole. All right, so let's talk about network infrastructure here a little bit, switching gears, right? We want to start off with continuous port scanning. So as soon as you're done looking at a web or a network asset, right, you want to go scan it again, see if something's changed, see if a firewall rule has inadvertently see if a firewall rule has inadvertently exposed something to your external network. Scanning both UDP and TCP ports is super important. I wouldn't say a full UDP scan is probably as important as a full TCP scan, because it takes forever to do a full UDP port scan. You want to fingerprint any of the versions of software that you can find that are sitting out there. You can use that. You can use mmap with the -S capital C capital V flags to get that information. Identify any services that may be running that have sensitive data on them potentially, can be done using ASM network scanning, or identifying services that are known to have remote code execution, for example, like Cisco Smart Install and port 4786. This is stuff that I look for in a pen test. I have a list of ports that are well known to have remote code execution vulnerabilities on them, and that stuff can be programmed into ASM. Whereas if you have a vulnerability scanner, you can't really necessarily program a list of well-known ports, right? And that helps you to eliminate low-hanging fruit by looking for stuff like that. So, all right, cloud enumeration. We're kind of touching, on this subject because cloud enumeration is becoming super important again, as we're moving to software as a service, infrastructure as a service models. We want to make sure that we're looking at open buckets, blobs, containers, whatever the company decides to name that service. Everyone seems to have their own version of naming schema for something like that. There's some differences when you're testing for cloud enumerate or clouds assets, in comparison to web applications and network infrastructure. You kind of have to combine the two, in my opinion, for cloud. And you want to look for your exposed APIs and API testing with something like Postman, for example, to make sure they're functioning properly, to make sure they're not causing any load issues on the application itself. You can automate some of this. You can't automate all of it. And so you want to check for API issues. You want to look at sensitive services that are open. You want to integrate tools such as Scout Suite or Cloud Enum to automate internal cloud security testing. And then again, upload all of that data to the ASM and get a holistic view of what your cloud security looks like. I included this little this little meme because I thought it was hilarious. Now I'm not worried about cloud security. My stored data is so disorganized to never be able to find anything. That's me. I pretend that I know what I'm doing sometimes and I can organize my data. No, it's a hot mess. So this is where I think ASM shines, right? I think historical data, and this is what executives really love, right? Historical data and buzzwords, it gets them going. It's kind of a big thing, right? And it's kind of where ASM has its aha moment. When you're looking at historical data, you have that data point where a new vulnerability comes out and it's like, okay, XYZ version of this software is vulnerable to remote code execution. So you can go create a new alert and say, tell me all of the systems that have XYZ version of this software installed and generate a list for me. Now, without having actively scanned or touched your assets, you can have a list of what's vulnerable to this newly discovered issue, right? And so that's where I think ASM really shines, in my opinion. It gives you that point of data reference to tell you whether or not something is vulnerable to an issue that has just come out 5 seconds ago without actually scanning it with a vulnerability scanner, or waiting for a vulnerability scanner to come out with a new detection for something. So that helps also to reinforce that when vulnerabilities are being fixed, you have that validation in ASM, and that money that is being spent on penetration tests or vulnerability scanning software and the staff to fix these issues, it's money well spent. And you can say, hey, look at this dashboard from 2 months ago, and then look at the dashboard from today. Look at all these issues that we fixed. Look at these assets and how their risk scores are going down because we've patched them, or we have fixed the ciphers that are being used, or we took the login page for this firewall off the external space, right? It gives you that point of time reference between one date and the next, so that you can tell your executives, I'm doing my job. Another important piece to this puzzle is historical data can tell you whether or not something has changed on a port or an asset itself. And we've discussed this, and I don't want to like hammer it too much harder, but I do still think it's important because it happens a lot where changes are pushed, or, an intern inadvertently exposes a port that's not really supposed to be exposed externally. And now all of a sudden you have a new attack surface, and your vulnerability scanner may not scan for another week. Well, your ASM is going to catch that, or it should catch that change. So something that did actually happen to me at a previous job, our firewall team pushed a change, not realizing that there was legacy rules that were in place, and the legacy rules somehow got rolled over, and it exposed a whole slew of login portals to the external space that didn't have any two-factor authentication on them. It led people to direct data that shouldn't be exposed. We caught that within 30 minutes because we had this model of, as soon as the scan is done, we run a new scan on ports. And so that's super important, that we have this historical data, that they have this change methodology in place, that as you're discovering changes are made, someone goes look at that change and see what the screenshot shows you and goes, hey, this is wrong. Something needs to be fixed here. So along the same vein, trends can be revealed in data. Those trends can point to systems with a higher level of vulnerabilities, and depending on the complexity of the vulnerabilities and whether or not they're exploitable, it can tell you whether or not that system's at a higher risk of compromise. You can combine this data to paint you a picture. And so say you have a system with a login portal, no multi-factor authentication, no brute force protection, and it's also old with plenty of vulnerabilities. ASM platforms will help you connect those dots and tell you, hey, there's a big problem here. You need to go either take this offline, segment it, or see if it's really necessary for business risk or business use, and evaluate that risk internally. So, I had to do some digging for this, for ASM success stories. And mostly the reason why I had to do digging for this is because we only really hear about breaches or bad data. you don't really hear about success stories where a company is like, oh yeah, I'm going to pat myself on the back because, hey, I found this exposed API that allowed unauthorized access to customer data. You don't really hear that too often. So here are 3 different like success stories that I was able to dig out. One of them was a baking institute. It's up here. I'm not going to read verbatim, but they had an exposed API. ASM caught it. Their team was able to identify it, patch it before any type of breach was occurred. Like I talked about in the previous company that I worked at, we found an exposed login because of a firewall change. And due to the fact that it was scanning continuously, we were able to detect the change, respond to it within 30 minutes. And that's pretty darn good, if I don't say so myself. And so I just want to bring up this point that every year, organizations that have ASMs deployed have a leg up, right, on discovering vulnerabilities as they're being disclosed. So here is kind of a good overview of some different platforms. Some of these aren't actually ASMs, like Alien Vault, it's not really an ASM. Intelligent X is not an ASM, and MS is not an ASM. But I wanted to call out some of these because I think that they're really important pieces to the recon puzzle and threat intelligence puzzle. And I wanted to make sure that people have those resources. Companies like Microsoft and VMware Labs have their own ASMs, and they are open source now. I haven't really played around with them too much, but if you want to play around with them, I put them up here just so that everyone has a good overview. Also on my personal GitHub, I have a and I can link that here at the end. I have a list of all of the ones that I could actually find that are sitting out there. And I tried to put together this list with like the URLs, a little bit of about me information about them. And I looked at the repos to make sure that they've been updated recently. And if they haven't been updated recently, I put an asterisk next to it to say, hey, you may not want to actually look at this, but I wanted to show them all because sometimes you can revive an ASM. Sometimes you can look at an ASM and say, hey, I think I can do something with this, but it's not exactly super pretty and I can still make it pretty. That stuff is out there and you can revive it. It's not bad per se. It just may not be updated. So one of the ones that I wanted to talk about today is Sniper. Sniper is pretty dang cool, if I don't say so myself. And this is not like, I didn't talk to Sniper about this. Sniper didn't reach out to me and was like, hey, we want you to demo our product. No, they have no idea that I'm doing this. Sniper has a paid for and a free version. I think their free version is really great from the standpoint of scanning, doing recon, automating all of the stuff, and then packaging it up in a nice, pretty report. Now, I tried to have a demo for you guys. Unfortunately, I corrupted 2 virtual machines this morning making this demo. So I'm just going to go off of some pretty pictures that I stole from their website. So here we go. Sniper, this is the community edition and the professional edition, and this is the breakdown of the flow chart. Like I said, it's pretty enhanced and it does quite a bit of information gathering for you, network scanning, vulnerability scanning. It can integrate a lot of different companies, a lot of different tools, and I shouldn't say almost all of it. All of it is open source. And one of the things that I do like about Sniper too is you can tell it to integrate other tools for you. It doesn't have to just be this stuff. You can take the software and customize it for your organization and add in different features for like S3 bucket enumeration. So that's something that's really neat in my opinion. And they also have the notifications built in with the Slack API. And I do apologize. I know that this screenshot is not exactly the most clear one ever. But it should still do the job of telling you everything it does. Now, again, Sniper does have a professional version available where you can add on different command modules for like command injection. It does things where it will automatically exploit vulnerabilities for you, do brute forcing for you, do fuzzing for you. But again, this stuff isn't necessary. You don't need to pay for Sniper Professional because there are open source tools out there that will do it for you. Like fuzzing could be done with a tool called FUF, right? Brute forcing can be done through using something like Furrowbuster and sec lists. That stuff doesn't need to be paid for. Port scanning, that can be done with mmap or mass scan. Like, you don't need to pay for this stuff. Now, the threat intel add-on is interesting, but again, I don't think that necessarily needs to be paid for. You can build your own by looking for all of the threat intel feeds that are out there and just compiling it into a data dashboard with something like Elastic and like Kafka. You can use those products to build you dashboards into Kibana. And that's what I did previously. We used Elasticsearch as our database, and then we used Kibana as the front end, and we built all these dashboards in Kibana to give us this high-level overview of what our environment looks like, what our recon looks like. It displayed all of the screenshots. It's pretty interesting what you can do with open source tools that are out there. So with that being said, let's go to the next slide. Again, sorry, these screenshots are not the most clear ones ever, but I wanted to at least just display it. Sniper is pretty easy to install too. You literally just have to git clone the repo and then cd into it and run the bash install script, and then you're ready to go. A lot of the scans that Sniper can do can be automated through like cron tabs, because it's all just command line usage, right? And then you have the front end database where you can look at this data and see it after the scans are done. It is a little bit resource hungry, I will say. That's the only downside to something like this, is you have to have something that has a little bit more resources. But again, I can run it on machine with like 4 gigs of RAM and 2 cores. It's not that huge of a resource hungry thing, but when you talk about scanning more assets, scanning more hosts, hosting more data, that's when it's going to become more resource hungry. And so one of the things that I did want to talk about too with Sniper, it uses something called Project Scope. And so it has templates that you can customize and expand on your own with custom exploits, or you can even port exploits over from other applications like Exploit DB. You can port that over to Project Scope and Sniper and then scan and do your own exploitation automatically in here. Now, again, use that with caution. You want to make sure that as you're looking at exploits, that you understand what the exploit's doing, you understand whether or not it's going to potentially DDoS or bring down your system. You want to understand with these exploits, if they're actually good exploits and if they're well known. You don't want to be willy-nilly running exploits on targets. That's not good. And so, with that being said, this is like the host table. They have different risk scores, actions that can be taken right from the ASM platform. You can schedule tasks, you can set up notifications. There's, a tab for credentials where I'm going to assume that you can run credential scanning. And then, make a nice pretty slideshow for your executives so they can ooh and ah over the damage. Here is kind of a vulnerability view. Again, nothing groundbreaking about this. It looks like almost any other vulnerability printout from any other vulnerability scanner that's out there. Tells you what the finding is, the target, and the evidence, and then the criticality. And then this is another thing that I think is super important. Like I said, when we're talking about web applications and screenshots, it pretty much looks like this is a copy paste of something like Eyewitness, or Go Witness, for example, another different one, application that you can use to take screenshots. But you have your screenshots here. It tells you what the target is. It fingerprints it. It tells you if it redirects to anywhere. It tells you the DNS. It tells you the DNS name, gives you the title, status, ports that are open, assigns it a risk score again, and then you could have actions. You can export this. Pretty cool. And having the ability to just view this and scroll down all of your screenshots, I cannot tell you, as an internal person, is the value of this is endless, because it cuts down on the time of running it and having to consolidate it or viewing all of the web applications independently. All right, so resource page, kind of bland here. When I was doing this presentation, and compiling all the data and compiling all the information. There's a lot of stuff out there. Almost all of the big companies have their own ASM module and their own blogs talking about ASM and how to implement it, what to look for, what to run, all of the vulnerabilities that you could potentially find. So you can just search ASM in Google to your heart's content and find blogs galore. So I just wanted to include like the top 3 in my mind. Again, the attack surface and OSINT tools list that I have in my repo, it's not conclusive. It's not the end all be all. But I did want to compile as much as possible to put in there. And now if anyone has suggestions on tools that I can include there, tools that I forgot, please feel free to comment on it. I'm not going to be offended thinking that I didn't catch everything. Sorry, a child just popped in my room. And then another thing is that cheat sheet from OWASP that's there to look at your attack surface from web analysis. And then Microsoft has a pretty good collection of management blogs or ASM management blogs and community contributions to ASM discovery and what it should look like, what people are doing. So, definitely pretty cool. And then questions. Anyone have any questions for me? I hope John's still here. You can see my little Easter egg there.
Great presentation, Ashley. That was awesome.
Thank you, Corey.
Yeah,
I only stumbled
a lot
over
of the
my words
questions.
like half the
Yeah,
time.
thank you so much. A lot of the questions were just confusion between ASM and vulnerability management. I think the thing that I kept telling people, and hopefully you would back this up, is it seems like vulnerability management is kind of the parent organization, and then ASM is rolling things into vulnerability management. Is that a reasonable thing to say?
Yes and no. I don't know. You and I could probably discuss this for years, right? Because you have very strong opinions and I have very strong opinions. I don't think that ASM and vulnerability scanning outweigh one another. I think they're on the same plane, right? And when you combine them together is when you get kind of like the like angels singing. I don't want to sing. I shouldn't have done that. But is when you get that moment, right? Where you get the angels singing and oh my gosh, everything looks so cool. I think that when they're used together, it's better. Yeah, sorry, John, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that this kind of gets into a bigger problem in the industry, right? With vulnerability management, it became just vulnerability scanning.
Mm-hmm.
And you had a bunch of people like, I buy Nessus, I buy, Qualys, I buy Rapid7, and my vulnerability attack surface is taken care of. But if you're actually looking at like MITRE as an example, as for a framework, it's like 2 or 3 squares out of that entire thing is actually addressed there. So I think that ASM is, I like to think of it as a much larger circle in the Venn diagram, and like things like vulnerability management, recon, all of that stuff would fit inside of it. That's kind of how I'm starting to look at it. This is a much more meta, larger view of the universe than just vulnerability management.
Yeah, like I think when you have your Venn diagram and you put all of your little circles together, right? In the middle is going to be where ASM is, right? And then you have your vulnerability scanning, you have your recon, you have your burp suite, whatever you want to call it, whatever you're doing elsewhere. It all kind of combines it together to give you that holistic, high-level overview.
And I think it's kind of what's needed. And I don't see a lot of vendors, you're like, here's how you can string all this stuff together. And it's always been interesting to me how the vulnerability management vendors haven't really started doing a lot of this. They're still focused constantly on prioritization. Like what should I patch first? And that's the wrong question, I think, in a lot of situations.
The other thing, Ashley, that is just amazing is that you managed to convince a lot of people in the audience to buy your ASM product that you don't have. So there's that. So good job. Good job. There were people asking for a demo. There were people asking for a POC. So you managed to convince everyone that you were selling something, even though you weren't. So that's very impressive.
That's great. Contact consulting at blackhillsinfosec.com and we will throw a proposal together. I mean, seriously, if we do
please
this,
no,
Ashley,
John, please no.
It wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the first time that a security company has just decided to start selling something that they actually don't have And it also would be the first time we've done that at Black Hills Information Security. It's like, we'll just build it as we go.
It'll be fine.
How hard can it be?
Well, and with that being said, like Corey and I have been talking about this for like 2 days, right? We were talking about it this week, but I think that it's something that's really needed, especially from these mom and pop shops that cannot, oh my God, I cannot talk now. But that don't have the budget to spend $10,000 a month on an ASM solution from some big name company out there. They just can't do that. And realistically, it's not feasible to spend 10 grand a month on an ASM solution when you're also spending X number of dollars on vulnerability scanning and, your XDR and your proof point or whatever.
Or if it's the first thing you do, right? It's a good first move. It's instead of, go buy EDR for $1,000 a seat or whatever, maybe consider just seeing what's out there before you do that. Or, your call.
Yeah. All right, what questions do we have on Discord?
Okay, yeah, let me look at the questions.
There's a bunch of questions here. I'm seeing a couple of repeats of people wanting to know source ASM tools specifically. I know you name dropped a couple of them. But what are some open source tools that people can use?
Well, that last slide right before questions, I think, had some repos.
Yeah, and my GitHub, I'll put a link into chat in a little bit. My GitHub has, I called it Frameworthy because I think I'm hilarious. But you can look for that in GitHub, and it has a good list of things. Now, obviously, it's not complete. Again, if there are some out there that you know of and think are awesome, drop me a line and I'll add it.
One of the best things about Black Hills is we don't do a lot of vendor endorsements or vendor bashing. You research the best tool for yourself, and that's really the way that it should be. If we decide to write an ASM framework, we will let you know.
Great point, Corey. And this particular webcast was brought to you by CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike, silence is poopy. Thank you. So
I think CrowdStrike actually does have an ASM, by the way.
Crap.
They do.
They do.
Yes, they do.
Oh crap! Now I'm on their mailing list. I'm gonna get an email from them saying,
God, you actually are going to get
things
paid.
about CrowdStrike.
They're just going to pay you. You're just going to get a check in the mail.
They will not pay me. Silence will be like, "Oh, you said poopy things about us again." So
Wading through logs just asked an interesting question. What's your take on Intel companies doing ASM? And maybe I'm just stupid, but what is Intel companies?
Threat intelligence company.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think it's kind of like the security scorecard companies that are out there. Like, we're just going to look at the external profile of your company and we're going to make a determination and give you a grade of A, B, C, D, or F. And I think that they're trying to oversimplify it. I don't know. I just don't think it's that mature of a space. Good God, I sound like I'm on one of those marketing.
I think so. To give a hot take and let Ashley drink some tea while I rant about things. I think that ASM, the beautiful part about ASM is that the whole goal of ASM is I guess like, not to use another security thing, but it's kind of like a SIM but attacking. So it's like you have all information sources of various kinds, whether it's threat intelligence or vulnerability scan data or port scanning data, or just someone has a Facebook that you want to monitor. You put all this stuff into one place and then you figure out how it's relevant later. So threat intelligence is definitely a component of ASM, because if you know that, someone's using a certain vulnerability or whatever, that's great. But if it doesn't map to your attack surface, if everyone's exploiting Fortinet and you don't use Fortinet, it doesn't matter. So you just paid a bunch of money for, attacks, threat intel that doesn't apply to your environment. So that's my take, at least. Ashley, what do you think?
I was not listening. I'm sorry, because I was reading a question about a shipping maritime company.
Just say you agree with them.
I agree, Corey. Yes, absolutely.
No. If you're gonna go that route, I would definitely say do not agree with me.
Okay. I don't know. I'll be completely honest, I was not listening. I'm so sorry.
There were some people, another interesting, I did read that question. A lot of people have, it's a generic question, which the question was basically like, we're a shipping company. We have, IoT devices scattered all throughout the globe. How can we even begin to identify those? If it were me working for your company, what I would do is figure out unique identifiers of one of them. So if let's say it's a ship, I'm going onto the ship, I'm figuring out what is a unique identifier of some kind, whether it's a JARM hash, SSL certificate, port number, host name, anything that I can use to identify that. And then you basically take that parameter of a filter and you apply that as broadly as you can, whether it's Shodan, your own scan data, whatever it is. So then you basically find a unique identifying characteristic and then you search for it everywhere. And you basically say, oh, I just found all of the instances of, the Axis Model 702 IP security camera on the internet. How do I figure out which ones of these are mine? That's, the next step.
And I think that depends on your network topology, right? Like if it's internal and it's all going outbound, the other thing you could do is run Zeek and you can do software inventory by doing
that's another
user agent strings. So there's a number of ways to do it. And of course, there's commercial products like Rumble out there. And then we have an open source one at activecountermeasures.com called Passer that will do inventory fingerprinting of your assets as well. So there are some tools that do that, all the way from commercial ones that are awesome to some open source stuff that you can do as Zeek, to tools like Passer, which can parse those logs out for you.
Yeah, and another person asked about air-gapped environments. I think I would basically just say, like, you're going to need sort of a man on the inside. You're going to need some scanning or asset inventory device inside the air gap, and then you're going to have to get that data off somehow. But really, if it's air gapped, like, you could just say, we only care about the air gap networks if they show up in attack surface management externally. Like, we only care if there is a breach in the air gap, right?
Yeah. And some other one of the questions that was proposed to me yesterday during a different call about this subject was, how do we identify things that we don't know about when we're doing like all the searching that we think we can actually do, right? And one of the suggestions that I had to them is, if you're looking for your company name, if you're looking for nicknames for your company name, if you're looking for all of that stuff already, then the next kind of step in my mind would be to scrape your website and start looking for some of the keywords that are on your website. That was also a really good way to identify systems that you may not know about.
Well, and there are times where you're just screwed. A number of years ago, I mean, we've had times, all of us when we're testing, where you go to the customer and say, here's all the IP ranges of all the systems that have, names or something associated with your company. And they're like, oh, those are in Europe. That's completely different from us. And that's handled by a different team. Those are out of scope. And you're like, crap. So it's hard. I think sometimes we oversimplify things a little bit more than we should as offensive people. But we're at the end. This is the end. No Doors reference. We're not going to do that. Bronwyn, no, you saw it coming. But we're going to do now is we're going to go off and ride the snake. If you would like to do psychedelic things with us, check out B-Sides Baltimore. We will be on site and virtual. Thank you so much, and we'll see you at our next webcast. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Kill it.